especially from where you sit now, your experience as NATO Supreme Allied Commander, you look at what's happening in the world right now, what do you think requires the greatest area of scrutiny in terms of how the U.S. government is handling diplomatic relations at the moment?
I think three areas kind of leap out. One is the Middle East, where the United States for a decade has been trying to reduce its presence, unsuccessfully thus far. We seem to keep getting pulled back into the region, perhaps with the ceasefire that's unfolding now between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Hezbollah, perhaps with the departure of Bashar al-Assad, perhaps with a weakened Iran. The United States can, in fact, begin to reduce its presence there. Let's hope so. Number two, and I think most obvious, is Ukraine and Russia. Here, in my view, the United States ought to continue to strongly support Ukraine. We ought to do that in concert with our allies. This is changing so quickly. I almost hesitate, but as we sit here today, we're hearing about a potential strategic mineral deal between the U.S. and Ukraine. I hope that occurs. It would bind us somewhat to Ukraine, and it would encourage our European allies, and it would discourage Russia. So that's a second broad area, and the question mark is the degree to which we'll continue to support Ukraine. And then third and finally, Jared, China, U.S. China relations, where are those going? That's the strategic mover on the global scene, U.S. China. I am hopeful the Trump administration will take a position with China of confront where we must, for example, about China's claims of territoriality in the South China Sea, confront where we must, but cooperate where we can, find zones of cooperation, avoid stumbling into a war, and ensure that we can keep the global economy moving along to the advantage of both nations. Those are kind of the three big ones.
I'll ask kind of a universal question about the Trump administration and how it's moving forward, how it's handling these diplomatic relations right now. With multiple irons in the fire, how is this being executed?
I'd say three qualities kind of jump to mind. The first is that a Trump administration, by its very nature, is going to be somewhat changeling. It will be 1 minute making nice with Vladimir Putin, but the next minute, let's hope, coming back to support. They're unpredictable, and that has some positive qualities in that your opponents don't know what to expect, but unfortunately your allies, partners, and friends don't know what to expect. So first quality I see out there is that of unpredictability. Secondly, I see, and I don't want to overuse this word, but I see a strain of isolationism here, a sense that, let's be honest, the campaign slogan is Make America Great Again. It's not make the world a great place to live. And part of that seems to be kind of pulling back from overseas engagement. I think that's a mistake. We made that mistake in the 1930s, pulled away from the world. It led to the Second World War. So I think a second strain of the Trump administration foreign policy is that of isolationism. And the third, and possibly most obvious, is peace through strength is the slogan. Let's draw a line under strength, and in the sense that a Trump administration seems unafraid to use U.S. muscle, U.S. military capability, U.S. economic leverage, tariffs, for example. So look for an activist, muscular foreign policy. Look for somewhat of a withdrawal back toward the United States, and above all, be prepared for unpredictability.
Well, to dive into that unpredictability through the lens of Ukraine, which, as you say, is evolving minute by minute, and I think has risen to the forefront of what we're paying attention to right now. What does it mean that there could be this deal in place with Ukraine for mineral resources, funds that would come back to the United States, maybe some inkling of security for Ukraine, but knowing that negotiations allegedly with Vladimir Putin could be even days away?
I think you have to be able here to hold two ideas in your mind at the same time. Let's take your latter point first, which is negotiations with Putin. Here, I think the Trump administration wants to start with a ceasefire, kind of freeze the frame, forces in place where they are, stop the bullets flying, and get people talking at a table. I support that. If we can get to that, then here's the second thing you have to keep in mind. What's the outcome? What are the minimums that you want to achieve? I would say to the Trump administration, the minimum you want to achieve is, number one, Ukraine gives up no further territory. Putin holds about 20%. No more territory for Putin. Number two, security guarantees, which I would argue must include probably European troops on the ground in Ukraine, probably British and French, but I would guess there'll be some Nordic troops. I would guess there'll be some Baltic troops, maybe some Poles. Create a pan-European force, put it in Ukraine, create a tripwire so that Putin feels less emboldened to take another bite at the apple of Ukraine. And third and finally, I think the administration has got to ensure that the Ukrainians feel the military supplies will keep coming. And the degree of those and the type of weapons and how fast they come and who pays, as between Europe and the United States, all to be negotiated. But I think Ukraine really needs those three things. If that occurs, then I think you can say to someone like Vladimir Putin, you're not going to invade again. You can sit on the 20% of Ukraine that you have conquered, as distasteful as that is to the West and to Ukraine. And you start to say to Putin, in those circumstances, Jared, we can begin to dial back some of these sanctions. I think that's the outline of a deal. Look for that to come into focus perhaps toward the end of the year.
For the people of Ukraine, how is that answered by President Trump saying that they can forget about being a member of NATO?
I think there's a temporal quality here, and I would say to my friends in Ukraine, and I've been in Ukraine many times, you are not going to be in NATO this year. You're not going to be in NATO in the next 2 or 3 years. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I think there's a path to NATO. I'll give you a practical example. It's the country of Finland. Finland was attacked in 1939 by Joseph Stalin's Russia. The Finns, like the Ukrainians, put up a spirited resistance in what was called the Winter War, and they effectively stopped the Russians. But given the disparity in size between massive Russia and much, much smaller Finland. The Finns are only 5 million as opposed to 40 million Ukrainians, but the Finns knew they would have to accept the idea of neutrality. Finland remained neutral from 1940 until last year when they joined NATO. So I'd say, yeah, there's not going to be an immediate path to NATO for our friends in Ukraine. Eventually, I wouldn't bet against it.
How does this all play out with the turmoil that's happening within our country right now? We see the level of protests rising. We see the level of confusion epic. A lot of people are trying to understand the recent cabinet meeting that President Trump had where Elon Musk presided. There's a lot of turmoil here to then even begin to understand what's happening internationally.
What we ought to recognize is that what happens in Washington doesn't stay in Washington. It's not like Vegas. What happens in Washington has instantaneous bleed-over effect globally. So yes, let's start with our opponents. Putin in Moscow, Xi in Beijing, the leaders of North Korea, the leaders of Iran, of Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. These are nations that are authoritarian states that are largely opposed to us. They are doing high fives, watching the level of confusion and Sturm und Drang and drama playing out. And by the way, I worked for Barack Obama for a good period of time as a senior military officer. We used to say about Barack Obama, no drama, Obama. He was very calm, very centered, very relaxed, pretty good qualities in my view. What we're seeing now is a turbulence that is going to embolden our opponents. And I'll give you one extremely practical example of that. It is the evident decision, at least so far, to shut down USAID, effectively to crater the idea of foreign aid. That is going to hurt the United States reputationally. It's going to embolden our opponents. It's going to discourage our allies, partners, and friends. And so, as all of these events unfold in Washington, from Elon Musk waving chainsaws and talking about cutting out whole government departments and being part of stopping vital U.S. aid overseas, it creates positive reviews in a lot of capitals where we would not want that to be the case.
Well, it seems to me that if you look at USAID, this is all about messaging. And there's a perception among so many Americans that this is us out doing good in the world. We're buying food and we're helping people get better and we're paying for schools without understanding that it has long been a stabilizing force so that there are not power vacuums that ultimately lead to conflict. So if, especially as we're in this age of misinformation, how can that be corrected if people aren't necessarily supporting USAID and they find merit in its dismantling?
We begin by those of us, including me, who have had deep personal experience alongside USAID talking about it. I recently wrote an article in Bloomberg. It's gotten wide circulation about why it's a mistake to destroy USAID. And let me offer three scenarios. I'll do it very quickly. I could give you 100 examples like this. Colombia, USAID took thousands of rebels and narco-terrorists off the battlefield by providing humanitarian opportunities. Direct positive impact for the United States when flow of cocaine was reduced because of what USAID did. This was not me as a military officer down there with my troops pointing guns at people. This was USAID taking our opponents off the battlefield. Number two, Haiti, a place where USAID has done a great deal of positive work. The security benefit for the United States is the avoidance of massive waves of refugees. We say we want to control the southern border. We've got to control our maritime border and avoid the kind of boat lifts that we saw in the 1980s and 90s from Haiti. USAID does that. And third and finally, let's go to the Middle East, Iraq, where we took Saddam Hussein's army off the field. A number of those combatants then became the Islamic State, but many did not, because of USAID programs that gave them a humanitarian path back to jobs, back to a scenario, a civilization that they could rejoin. Again, think about the Islamic State with 10 times as many terrorists. That would have been the case if not for, in some ways, the efforts of USAID. Bottom line, your point, it's not charity. We don't do this because it's the right thing to do. I think we should. It is the right thing to do, but there are deep pragmatic benefits for the United States in this.
I want to shift for a moment to you as a writer.
Sure.
And the lens at which you are looking at all of the things we have just discussed, the conflicts we've just discussed, the diplomatic relations that we've just discussed, but through the prisms of novels. You've written you've written many, actually, many books, but 2034 and 2054, co-written with Elliot Ackerman, that look at what leads up to the next World War.
Yeah.
How does the fiction writing help you understand our times?
Well, the reason I shifted to writing fiction, I wrote initially 13 books of nonfiction and then began writing novels. I wanted, the ability to splash more paint around on the screen and tell a story. Number two, I find that readers resonate to human stories, and it helps you make powerful points by telling stories. And number three, it's just enjoyable to kind of make it up and not be in that straitjacket of footnotes and nonfiction. So in the case of the two novels you mentioned, they're named after the years. It's the year 2034 and the year 2054. The first one deals with a war between the U.S. and China. The second one deals with artificial intelligence and domestic conflict here in the United States. In both cases, Jared, the books are not predictive fiction, I hope not, but they are both works of cautionary fiction. The idea is we ought to be able to read a novel about how terrible it would be if the United States and China stumbled into a war like the Europeans did in 1914, or how terrible it would be if artificial intelligence was able to completely bend the arc of our politics here in the United States. Those are both very real challenges, and frankly, we may not have to wait until 2034 or 2054 before we come much closer to the reality in those two novels.
I was going to say it sounds awfully predictive to me. Clearly, in the time we spent together, I understand how much a student of history you are. Is it comforting to know history, or does it leave you distraught?
I think it's comforting, and I'll put it this way. I often do with friends who are, understandably wringing their hands about the horrors of today's world and everything is falling apart. Yeah, I'm worried. There are challenges. Let's go back 100 years ago. We're in the middle of the Spanish influenza, which infects 40% of the world's population with a 20% mortality rate. Europe has been destroyed by World War I. The United States has embarked on total isolationism. We have erected massive tariff walls. Hawley Smoot tariffs are about to appear, and we're soon going to crack the global economy, enter into a Great Depression, and you can drop a plumb line in the 1930s to the rise of fascism, Second World War, 80 million dead. That's a really bad period of time. So I think if you look at history, it can help you keep in perspective what's happening today. Maybe it's not quite as bad as the 1930s, 1920s. And then secondly, from history, we can find ideas, lessons, ways of trying to reverse engineer what's happening in front of us and avoid the kind of calamitous 20th century. More people died in wars in the 20th century than in human history combined. 21st century, so far, we have avoided a great power war. We have avoided a true global pandemic killing hundreds of millions of people, which in a comparative way is what happened with Spanish influenza. We have improved in some ways. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but I think history can help us understand that in the midst of all of our despair, there are lessons, and we are not, as in many ways, as without the tools that we need today. We didn't have them 100 years ago. Hopefully we can avoid those kind of calamities.
Well, I am wise enough to know when to end on a positive note, especially knowing how much you have seen over your very storied career. Admiral James Stavridis, thank you so much for being with us.
Jared, what a pleasure. Thank you.